Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to crack the code on how to get top marks in your exams. And we're going to do it by reverse engineering a perfect answer, not from a textbook, but by going straight to the source, the official mark scheme that the examiners themselves actually use. So where are we getting this inside info? Right here. This is the official AQA GCSE Biology mark scheme from a recent higher tier paper. This is the document that tells an examiner exactly what gets a point and what doesn't. You can think of it as the ultimate cheat sheet, and we're about to show you how to use it. So here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to decode the question from an examiner's point of view. Then, we'll unpack the answer key for a big 6-mark question and actually build a perfect response, point by point. We'll also hit a shorter question before we wrap up with how you can use this whole technique to completely transform your revision. All right, let's dive in. You know, if you want to beat the exam, you've got to learn to think like an examiner. And that really means understanding their single most important tool. So what even is a mark scheme? Well, yeah, it's the official answer key, but honestly, it's so much more than that. It breaks down every single acceptable answer, it lists different ways of phrasing things, and it even tells examiners what common mistakes to ignore. For us, it's literally a blueprint showing precisely what earns points. Now, to keep this super practical, we're going to zoom in on just one question from that paper, question 9. It's a pretty high-value question all about genetically modified crops, and it's split into 2 parts worth a total of 8 crucial marks. Let's kick things off with the first part of that question, the big 6-marker. Now, I know these long-form questions can seem really intimidating, but the mark scheme shows us that they're really just a series of smaller, logical points all chained together. The question basically asks for an explanation of how these special GM soy plants, the ones that are resistant to herbicide, could produce a bigger harvest. So what does a level 3 response, that's the top band for getting 5 or 6 marks, actually need to have in it according to the people who do the marking? Well, the mark scheme doesn't give you one single perfect paragraph. Instead, it provides what it calls indicative content, which is basically a checklist of the key scientific ideas it expects to see. For this question, a top answer has to connect the dots between the herbicide's effect, the impact on competition, the process of photosynthesis, and how the plant uses its resources, all in one logical story. Okay, now for the fun part. Let's actually build that perfect answer step by step. We're going to use the exact phrasing straight from the mark scheme to put together a flawless full mark response. All right, point number 1. This is the absolute foundation of the whole answer. The mark scheme says to start by just establishing the basic idea. The herbicide, glyphosate, kills the weeds, but the genetically modified soya plant is completely unharmed. Everything else we're about to say builds on this one single fact. So, that leads to the next logical step. If the weeds are dead, what happens? It's simple. The GM soy faces way less competition. And you've got to notice how specific the mark scheme is here. It wants you to say what they compete for. Light, water, ions, even just the physical space to grow. The next link in our chain connects that lack of competition directly to a core biological process. With more access to light and water, the rate of photosynthesis in the soya plant goes up. And what's the immediate result of more photosynthesis? You got it. More glucose is produced. And this right here is where a good answer becomes a great one. See, the mark scheme shows that a top-level response doesn't just stop at more glucose. It explains what the plant actually does with all that extra energy. It uses it for respiration, to build cellulose for strong cell walls, and to create the proteins and starches that ultimately become the crop's yield. And to really lock in those top marks, the scheme suggests adding even more detail about the other resources. You could mention that more water is used for turgor pressure and transport, or that more nitrate ions are absorbed to build proteins, or even more magnesium to make chlorophyll. This level of specific detail is what separates a 6 from a 4, every time. And here it is, the crucial instruction, pulled directly from the mark scheme itself. To get into level 3, that top tier for 5 or 6 marks, your answer must explicitly link all of these biological details back to the main point of the question, how all this leads to an increased yield. You have to close the loop. Okay, so that's the big 6-marker completely cracked. Now let's take a look at the second, much shorter part of the question. This one was worth 2 marks, and it focused on the potential concerns that surround GM crops. The question simply asked for two common concerns people have about growing GM crops. For a straightforward question like this, the mark scheme gives a simple checklist of acceptable, distinct points. All you have to do is hit any two from their list. Now this is where the mark scheme gets really, really useful. It shows every possible correct answer you could have given. But just as important, it tells the examiner what not to accept. For example, vague stuff like cost gets you nothing, but increased cost of seed is perfect. And, crucially, it also says to ignore ethical or religious arguments, keeping the answer strictly in the world of science. So, after taking apart that entire question, what's the big takeaway from all this? I mean, how can you actually apply this to your own studies? Here it is, the main thing to remember. The mark scheme is your single most powerful revision tool. You should stop just doing past papers and hoping you're on the right track. Instead, you need to actively study the mark schemes. They are the blueprint showing you the structure, the key terms, and the exact level of detail you need to score every single mark. By working backwards from the perfect answer, we've basically learned to think like an examiner and organize our knowledge to meet their exact requirements. It really leaves us with one final thought. Now that you know precisely what the examiners were looking for, does it change how you'd approach that original question in the first place?